Thank you, Nina. Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Thank you, Don, and all of you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, to be able to address you in the few minutes that I have. I will fill in about 35 years of history, personal history, and it shouldn't be a problem because my focus really is going to be about the political lessons learned while I was with Cesar and traveling with Cesar and working with him, and others on the board and the union, such as Dolores Huerta, who Nina and I just had the pleasure of spending almost a whole day with her not long ago when she was here in San Marcos. So anyway, let me get started here. First of all, and Nina, on that point with regards to Region 10 of the Chicano Latino Caucus, I have some very good news. Don't let me forget it, okay, because it's not part of the talk. It's a short email that I just got from the president, an old friend of mine, Harvard graduate, Carlos, who's now the chairman of the Chicano Latino Caucus in Sacramento. And I'll talk about Carlos because I had recruited Carlos to work for the UFW legal department. So it's funny how life works, huh? It weaves in and out. Such a beautiful tapestry. So I brought this little relic that I have, and it was one of Cesar's favorite pictures. It's the one that's been on your website. And that was a picture taken in Salinas in 1979 when Cesar was leading 5,000 workers to Hartnell College. We started out from where the United Farm Workers headquarters were, and we're headed to Hartnell College, which is the community college there. And as we're going under a railroad underpass on our way there, we were a little more than halfway. All of a sudden, two blazers of Monterey County sheriffs pull up, picking up dust and just getting out of their vehicles, all in like SWAT gear, and they started running towards Cesar. The first of the officers, or the sheriff's deputies, is the one I'm holding back. In essence, I never touched it, sort of got freaked out a little bit by the electricity, I guess, that had been generated by 5,000 followers. It was an amazing picture. And it was taken by the Associated Press, and I actually got to speak to the photographer who took it. He says, "Oh, I remember that photo." And so the funny thing about it was that the day afterwards, 2 days. This was Saturday, the day after the march. I go to San Jose to visit some friends. And I go to this store, and here I am on the front page. Now, I was no longer acting as a bodyguard to Cesar, which I did from time to time. I was thinking as a lawyer that I had to be in court in Salinas before a couple of Superior Court judges who might very well arrest me for contempt. It was all over, but it didn't happen. I did not get arrested. So, let me tell you a little bit about my background. How did I get involved in the United Farm Workers Union? My mother's family were primarily from Mexico, although my mother was born in New Mexico, but they were from Mexico, rather in Chihuahua. And so she had dual nationality. And they were miners. And so the farm worker background did not, we weren't farm workers, but you know, I found out about it while I lived in Bakersfield, California. My mother had a Mexican food business, and I would always tag along with my cousin. Even as a kid, he was one of the delivery persons. And that took me to the labor camps around Bakersfield, Kern County, Arvin, Lamont, Wasco, any of you who are familiar with that area. And I saw the dire conditions under which farm workers lived. And by dire, what I mean is some of their bedding was under trees, exposed to spiders and insects, the heat. They slept on cardboard boxes. Lucky if they were, they had a crate or something more comfortable. They ate, in many cases, food that was horrible. It was very horrible. In fact, we got to one camp the worst I've ever seen, labor camp. And the kitchen was in a shock. It was about to fall. And what they were boiling for them was really rotten chicken. That was going to be the lunch for the day for these Mexicans who were living there. And so when I saw that, I started getting interested and started asking a lot of questions, as one does at this age. I was going to a Catholic school in Bakersfield, and there was one of the Christian brothers was Leroy Chatfield. And Leroy played a real role in my life because Leroy, after being called a communist for his support of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, left the order, the Christian Brothers Order, and went to work full-time for the Union. And he was a real influence. Influential also was a friend of his, the son of a Bakersfield rabbi, Marshall Gans, who I would see. You know, he was the one that was out recruiting and eventually recruited Leroy out of the Christian Brothers. And so, looking at that, when I was a senior, a friend of mine said, you know, you ought to go meet Cesar. This was Jean Brooks. Her sister had graduated as a nurse and went to work. And when I say work with the union folks, you all understand this was volunteer work. Okay, that was the exciting thing about the union in those days. We all volunteered. It didn't matter if you were a graduate from Yale, Berkeley, or wherever, or whatever your former occupations or professions were. When you came in, you worked as a volunteer. So we all like to say we worked with, not for Cesar. Okay, and that's how it was. It was a beautiful world. It really was. I've never worked harder, but I'll get to that point. So anyway, can somebody tell me when it's 5 minutes before my time? Thank you. All right. So I started getting involved. In 1968, I went to Delano when Cesar broke his first fast. It was a 25-day fast, the one depicted in the movie, for any of you who've seen that. And I went to do a civics project for Brother Fabian, I think it was. And so I was really fortunate because there for the first time I saw the full impact of what a movement is. There were about 10,000 people at the Delano Park. Cesar had been fasting for 25 days. He was very weak. And Bobby Kennedy came. He flew out to break the fast with him. So I show up. I borrowed my mom's station wagon. I show up with my Super 8mm camera. You know, here the reporter. I actually spent the night before in a hotel, and then so that I could be there early enough to beat the crowd and to get, you know, a good position. So I was jumping all over. For some reason, they had set up 2 stages. I'll never know why. Okay, but they had set up 2 stages. I happened to choose the wrong one. So I had to work myself through the clouds, climb atop a tree, you know, to catch some good sights. When it was over, the ceremony was over, I thought, darn it, I didn't get close to Cesar. And I thought, but you know what? I'll get close to Bobby Kennedy, because he had to leave. Cesar, that's another question. Okay. So what I did, I went and I got to be part of the human cordon, right? Security. And if this had happened today, I would have got shot probably, because I had my camera back here, right? And as soon as Bobby Kennedy comes up to me, I pull out the camera, the Super 8, and start filming. It was another world then. But anyway, he actually looked at me and he said, "You've been busy this morning, haven't you?" And I said, yes, I have, Mr. Senator. Thank you. And so it's so weird with this, you know, new tech and stuff. It was about 3 years ago. I'm doing research for a book, my memoir on these years, and I was looking for pictures, and lo and behold, there's a picture of me, and it's on my Facebook for anyone who's been on there. There's a picture of me actually smiling with Bobby Kennedy. I'm about to put the camera down, and that's when this exchange occurred. It was amazing. So, and then we all know. This was in '68. I did bird dogging, as we called it, precinct walking for Bobby Kennedy, and then we lost him. And with him on the same stage before he was killed was Dolores Huerta, you know, and we lost a hero. So that was my first, I suppose, political lesson. If you get into politics and you're really effective, you can get killed. And of course we saw shortly thereafter the death of Martin Luther King. Same. You know, Martin Luther King had not been assassinated until he supported a union strike. Correct? That's right. So when you pose an economic threat in this country, you better watch out. But you see, that's the key for people to advance. It's a very important one. And I'll be reading an excerpt out of a book. It's an excellent book that I highly recommend. It's by Jacques Levy. He traveled and wrote this book for about 6 years. He expected to do it in 1 year, but he lasted 6 years doing it. And he did a marvelous job. It's called Cesar Chavez, Autobiography of La Causa. And so, at any rate, there were other lessons. You know, the boycott was so successful. The boycott of grapes, for all of you who recall those years, remember? Okay, yeah. And you know, I was a boycotter between colleges, community college in Bakersfield, and then I went to San Jose. I boycotted in one of the foggiest areas of LA. And that was the year the growers came to their knees. The table grape growers in the Delano area, southern San Joaquin, said, no mas. They were crying for a law. And Governor Brown, as you might also recall, was the governor then, and the law was pushed through. Okay, the law was pushed through. It was a give and take. We lost the right to a secondary boycott. But we had been telling the public who supported us, 17 million U.S. citizens, they supported the boycott. And that was amazing. It had never been seen before. And one of the things we said, we don't have a law, because they said, well, why don't you vote and have elections? Well, we don't have a law. Well, we got the law. And at about 1:30 in the morning, Governor Brown, Jerry Cohen, and all these grower representatives from Sacramento wanted to hear it from the horse's mouth. Cesar said, no, I've got my authorized representative there. Let him okay it. No. So they pulled in growers from all over California, flew in their private jets or whatever, but they got there, and so finally, when you've got about 45 people, including the governor in the room, Cesar was asked, do you approve? And he said, I most definitely approve. And they were sitting at the ends of their chairs, and they all applauded. The growers did. But you know, there's another political lesson to learn. I looked up, actually, I know what a think tank, and certainly we've all heard about think tanks, right? And here's a very simple definition. A body of experts providing advice and ideas on specific political or economic problems. Okay, so when we talk about political action, we always have to be aware. And as we know now, okay, because of the decision of the Supreme Court in Citizens United, all right, there are people who have already been there. They have all the money in the world. They buy the most brilliant minds to sit down and plan out how to diffuse power, how to distract, how to screw the 99%. Sorry for the term, but that's the way it is. And we have to be aware of that too. Now, I was going to, initially, I had asked or thought of playing you an excerpt of a speech that Cesar gave before the San Francisco Commonwealth Club in 1984. Because, for one, it's very prophetic. He talks about the trials and tribulations of organizing farm workers, the poorest of the poor in our country. He talks about that. And he talks about the failed hopes in regards to the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. Because although it was joyous for a while, the union won more than 95% of the elections in the fields. Okay? They won almost all of the elections. And so then what do the growers do? And they probably, even when it was passed, they probably had Deukmejian in the wings. Because what happened is, Deukmejian comes in as governor, and they scuttle the law. First of all, they refused to fund it the very following year in '76. And then they went even further. They put in their own people in the board, the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, including the General Counsel, who is the person to enforce the law. That's what they did. And so now in this speech, Cesar, in 1984, he was hurting. But he hadn't given up. And he said, you know, he said, people sometimes measure our work and our union only in terms of other unions. But you see, the UFW was never completely a union. And that's one of the pressures that Cesar had a lot. There were people who, for many reasons, expected Cesar to be something for them. You know, a syndicalist, solely a syndicalist, a union man. Or solely a movement person, because the Chicano movement was really spawned, supported, and encouraged by Cesar. We had other leaders, of course, I being a Chicano and part of that movement. We had leaders in New Mexico, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, Ángel Gutierrez in Texas, and we had Corking Gonzalez in Colorado. But Cesar really and the union were the ones that pushed that movement as well. And so liberals, sorry to say, oftentimes attack Cesar for that. And they still are. You know, there's a book written by a woman named Powell. She used to be with the LA Times. And she's very critical of Cesar. And she's also friends of some of the people I was asked to get rid of from the union because it was the proverbial tail trying to wag the organizational dog. Okay, that's why you don't hear about me. A lot of people say, 5 minutes. A lot of people say, well, you know, we didn't see you in the movie, or, well, that was before my time, but, you know, we didn't read about you here. And I mentioned a couple of times, but I went through this very, very difficult period in the union when our own legal department turned against Cesar and the leadership of the union. You know? And they started counter-organizing. And so I was given the task of taking over the legal department. And so that was that. Let me go into the political work, okay? Because we've talked about some of the problems. And, you know, Nina's been working on education and privatization of what's going on there, which is a real issue. You know, and it's also a union issue, you know, and extremely important. Of course, if you want to know the truth, and here's where our conservative brothers and sisters might have a head up on us. The first privatization that happened in this country was 1913 with regards to the Federal Reserve Act. I mean, talking about privatization. We don't need to go there right now. What I'd like to talk about, in ending, I'd like to talk about what I'm doing now. You know, as some of you know, I am no longer taking as much an active role in Alianza. I'm still very supportive. My heart's fully in it. But with the full cooperation and encouragement of Nina, I have gone on to the political work that she mentioned. And this goes, I already mentioned, when the elections come around, I'm always, so I guess because I'm Latino, I'm always asked, what about the Latino vote? And I'm thinking, well, I don't know. I've got some ideas, but why don't you ask them? Right? Go to Northgate, have lunch, have breakfast, sit down, talk to them. Some speak English, and you'll find out why. This is like occupied territory, folks. Right? We've still got the Border Patrol, as we used to call it here. Nina and I canvassed, actually we delivered papers to the flea market a few weekends last year, and we spoke to them. It's a people who are oppressed, who don't feel enfranchised, who are scared. I think they lost 50% of business at the flea market. We heard this from many merchants. Okay, our prison system is out of control, right? And what politicians are taking positions? Those are brothers and sisters, many of them not there for violent crimes. Why don't we break down that border mentally too? Oh, he's felon, sure, can't get a job, When are we doing that? Are we doing that? Should we do that? We have to. We can't back down. We have to take these issues by the horns and do what's just and right. Okay, and then Latinos, starting in District 1, will start seeing, okay, this is not just talk, but we have to take on the issues. And so, with that in mind, let me say here that, like I told you, Carlos Alcalá had recruited, he was working for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Health under Mario Bledo. Mario Bledo was pulling him, I was pulling him from the other side, because he was such a brilliant, and is such a brilliant person and attorney. In fact, when I was driving him down, it took me about 4 parties, going away parties in Sacramento, to pry him loose from Sacramento, but I did it, I survived it. And I had all his furniture were loaded up by tomato workers. And after the party, I told Carlos, it's time to go. So I packed him up, we pulled his car, and when we get about Fresno, remember there's no cell phones then, I got on the cell phone, on the pay phone, and I called Cesar and I said, Cesar, I've got a U-Haul truck, packed, and guess who's in it? Cesar knew, so he broke into like a John Wayne drawl. He said, bring him in alive. And he's barely alive, but he was incredible. So now Carlos is doing this incredible work in Sacramento. And this is an email that I got from him yesterday. Very encouraging, because all of us, I think, have had the idea the youngsters have to get involved. We have to start at a young age. It's important. And the project that Carlos took on about a year ago that's been doing incredibly well in other areas is voter registration of high schoolers. I'm almost done. Okay, so here is the exciting memo that we all got, all of us in the Chicano Latino caucus of the Democratic Party. It says, prior to our meeting next week to request assistance on high school voter registration, Superintendent Torlakson and Speaker of the Senate Padilla issued a marvelous landmark memo promoting high school registration. The memo provides tools for implementation that should be incorporated into our ongoing efforts. It is well thought out and goes even further than we were asking. This memo is a direct result of CLC, that's the Chicano Latino Caucus efforts over the last 2 years. Congratulations to all. Notably, there are pilot programs in Fresno, Alameda, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Diego. That's great. That's marvelous. And so, you know, like for instance in Yolo County, which is closest to Sacramento and where Carlos has been very directly involved with the region vice chair there, they've done tremendous gains. There's a lot of new registered voters. So